Hello everyone, my name is John Azzi. I'm a fashion designer based in Sydney, Australia. And for today's tutorial, I'm going to talk through how to make a car coat. This car coat example is for women's wear, but the same rules can be applied for menswear. Before I start cutting out my main body pieces, I need to block fuse this fabric. So basically what block fusing is just cutting the yardage or the meterage of your fabric, and then you're going to lay a fusible interfacing on top and then fuse the whole thing so everything is just nice and stable before you start cutting. So we do that to the main body piece. Again, not with the sleeve pieces because we want a bit more flexibility with the sleeve. So what I'm doing now is the right side of the fabric is facing down and the wrong side is facing up. And with my fusible interfacing, the sticky side of the fusing needs to face down. And I'm just going to pin this nice and taut. And the key here is it must be nice and flat all the way throughout and no rippling with the fusing as I'm going with the iron. So I'm going to work from left to right because I'm right-handed, but if you're left-handed, you work from right to left. So what I'm going to do is I'm not sweeping like this with the iron. So your iron needs to be on high steam. So important, don't sweep because it will create ripples in your fabric and you really do not want that when you're doing that. So the goal here is get your iron on high steam and press down flat for 3 seconds on high steam. So 1, 2, 3, and that should be fused. And the next section, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, so you're nice, infused fabric. So once it's fused, so you do a seat base, and I version, which is nice, and so you do all the fabric. Now I'm going to start off with the pieces that I have not block fused, but these are piece fused. So the sleeve pieces are only piece fused because I need to allow for movement within the sleeve because I need this flexibility in the fabric, otherwise it will be too rigid. So this is the undersleeve, cut as one pair, and these two are my upper sleeves. So this is also cut as one pair, and I've also piece fused, allowing for movement within the sleeve body. So this is upper sleeve. Important notch is my sleeve head notch and my cuff notches with the addition of my seam allowance notches. So these pieces are my stand collar. So I've cut one pair in my horsehair canvas, and I've also cut one pair in my stand collar, which has been block fused. So after I've established those, I'm going to stay stitch these two together, but that's for another step. This is my outer collar, which I've just cut on the grain, and this has also been block fused, and I've also cut a horsehair interlining for the upper collar. So this is my under collar, which has been cut on the bias for both pieces, and there is seam allowance at the center back seam, and as well as seam allowance all the way around with all my pieces. And I've cut one pair which has been block fused, and the interlining pieces which has also been cut as one pair. Front of the car coat, which I have block fused first, and then I have piece fused according to my patterns. I've also drill holed the placement of my welt pocket and fused the hem section of the coat. I've cut one pair, and the one pair should be on grain. I've also notched my lapel notch here and my break point here. very important. I've also notched my underarm, and I've notched my waist seam. Now this is the back left hand side of my coat, and it has a center back seam which I want, and I've block fused this section, and I've piece fused according to my pattern piece, and my left hand side of the jacket has the mitered corner here. Right here it has this cut off section, which is very important when we go to attach the lining to this piece. So this is the left hand side. And this is my back right hand side. Again, I have block fused. And piece fused on top. And the right hand side does not have the mitered corner. Now this is for my slanted welt pocket. I have cut one pair, and it is slightly going on the bias, which is completely normal. This is following the grain line of the body. And this is my under pocket, which has the extra added seam allowance, so it can accommodate for the cut section of the welt pocket. And I also have my upper pocket here, which will accommodate with the trimmed seam allowance, which will accommodate for the upper section of the welt once we come to cut. For my front linings, I have my two facing pieces, which have also been block fused. And important notches are my breakpoint notches here, and the notch here where I attach my collar, and obviously my seam allowance notch. Now these are my two front lining pieces, which have been cut on as one pair, and the most important notch here is the 10 centimeter notch here, because it's very important for me to mark that when I come to stitch the facing to the front linings. This is the right hand side of my back, of the back piece, right hand side. So this one has the pleat at the back, but most importantly, this has the hollowed out section for the vent, and this one is just kept as a straight seam. So this one has the hollowed out section, and it's the right hand side of the back. This is my left hand side, and I've also retained my pleat here, but I've also have not hollowed out this section of the vent, because it's very important when we go to stitch the vent to the main for one side to be hollowed out and the other side to be retained. My underarm lining pieces, so these two have been cut as one pair, and I've also notched my underarm notches and my seam allowance notches. And this is my upper sleeve linings, which I have cut as one pair, and the important one to keep a note of is the sleeve head notch, which is very important, and my seam allowance notches. I'm going to start with connecting my interfacings with my collar pieces. So I've just laid out my horsehair carefully on my on the back side of my collar pieces, and I'm just going to pin them all in place, and I'm going to take them to the machine. So these are my stand collars here. So I've just carefully laid out. I'm going to pin these carefully together, and then I'm going to take them to the machine and stay stitch everything in place. And the stay stitch should roughly be 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters away from the cut edge. My collar pieces have been stabilized with the horsehair canvas on each side. So I've just done a stay stitch around, just using the edge of my foot on the sewing machine, which is roughly 0.3 centimeters or 1/8 of an inch. I've done the same with my under collar pieces. Now what I need to do is right sides facing. I need to join the back seam at at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is what the undercollar should look like, and I've just given my undercollar a good press. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my stand collar, and right sides facing, I'm going to stitch my stand collar to the bottom section or the more curved section of my outer collar. So I'm going to do that to my underpiece and my two over pieces. So I'm going to position them like this, and I'm going to stitch around, and we'll do that, give them a good press, and then I'll come back and continue. So now that I have my stand collar sewn to my upper collars, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this to the iron and give all of this seam allowance a press down into the stand collar. And once I've done that, I'm going to take this to the sewing machine with my seam allowance facing into the stand collar, and I'm going to give this a understitch here, and I'm going to do this for both the under collar and the upper collar. Now that I have my collars pressed and understitched, as you can see, there is a row of understitching here. I need to eliminate all of this bulk that's left over from the seam allowance, so I'm just going to trim that back. Just be careful not to cut the upper section of the collar. Now that my upper and lower collar have been trimmed, the seam allowance, what I need to do is I need to actually join and bag out two of my collars. So I'm going to align them together. And the only part I'm going to leave open is this section here. So all of this needs to get bagged out, and I'm going to leave, so starting my stitch from this corner here, I'm going to go all the way to this corner here. I've sewn my edges together, so from this point to this point, all the way around. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip my corners. And I'm going to bag this collar out. I'm just going to gently, very gently, use my scissors to bag these corners out like this. Beautiful. And now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I want to do an understitch from my collar and understitch all of this. So understitching all of the seam allowance underneath gets flicked back to the undercollar, and I'm understitching here as far as it needs to go here. So maybe I'll stop 3 centimeters away from the bagged out corner and finish here. So once I've done my understitching, I'm just going to take this to my iron and just give this a nice press. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a stay stitch around these corners that are still left on the raw edge, and I'm just connecting everything together from the underside. So essentially both the upper collar and the lower collar are going to be joined as one piece for now. Everything has been stabilized for the time being. As you can see, the collars have been stay stitched together, which is exactly what I want. What I can go ahead to my iron and do is actually press this stand collar down like this, and then once I've done that, I can just put this to the side for now and continue on to the next. I'm going to start with my welt pockets, since my front pieces are still in individual pieces and not joined together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my welt pocket first, and then I'm going to join it as 0.5 or 1/4 inch on each side, and then I'm going to back that out. Now that I've joined each side, what I'm going to do is snip each corner. Then I'm going to turn this inside out. Just going to use my scissors again just to give it a good turn out for the corner, like so. I'm going to go give this a good press, and then I'm going to do an edge stitch around at 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to start with my welt pocket. So this is the side welt pocket where you can put your hand through, and it's going to be a functioning pocket. What I've done here is I've marked my drill holes on the right hand side of the fabric, and I'm going to position my welt. So it's going to be positioned 5 millimeters in from the edge of the welt like this. So I've just positioned my welt, and I've just marked in with my vanishing pen 1 centimeter in on the raw edge of my welt, and this is my folded edge of my welt. As you can see, it's cut on grain, so it follows the grain of the body. This is very important. If you have cut this on the wrong grain, you will be able to notice it, as the weave will be different from this. So just be careful with this piece. But I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and stitch from here to here, and then I'll come back and explain. Once I'm done with my stitching, so I've stitched my welt pocket down, I've just marked in 1 centimeter down and then 1 centimeter out, again 1 centimeter up and then 1 centimeter out. I've just drawn a line here just to indicate where I want to be stitching. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab my upper pocket, and I'm going to position it like this, and I'm going to pin it into place. So I'm going to stitch this at 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I need to make sure that these two raw edges are just aligned together, edge on edge, and I'm only stitching this section here. Very important, as this essentially becomes the pocket bag underneath. So we'll do that and we'll continue. This is what it should look like once it's stitched down. So my seam allowance are still left loose, which I want exactly. So I flipped this to the wrong side with the right side facing down. What I've done here is you can see the stitches from here to here, and I've just marked in where I want to make my incision. So this incision should end at the middle of the last stitch. So when you go to cut, it cuts in the middle of the last stitch and roughly 3 millimeters away from the stitch, because we don't want to cut into the stitching and we don't want to cut too far out, otherwise it will create too much puckering and it will create a dimple, which we do not want. So essentially we are going to be snipping into this. When I start to cut, I'm only cutting the main body, and I need to make sure that I'm not cutting into my welt or my lower pocket bag. So now I'm back on the right side of my fabric. What I want to do is get my upper pocket bag and position it like this. So essentially it's creating a little heart shape, if you want to think of it that way. And what I'm going to do is actually follow the stitching that I've done on my welt here, and I'm going to stitch my pocket only to the welt section. So all of my seam allowance needs to be poking through like this, and I'm just following my original stitch that I've done on my welt. So at 1 centimeter again, where I position my pin to the other pin here, only the welt section, I'm going to be stitching that. Once I've stitched that into place, what I want to do is take my fabric to the iron, and I'm going to gently press my fabric into here, and then I'm going to give this a good understitch. So I'm keeping my seam allowances untouched. I'm just going to be stitching where I've stitched already for the understitching. This is so I can keep my pocket bag in. As you can see, it's been pressed into the pocket, and I've just done my understitching, leaving my seam allowances untouched. Now what I want to do is I want to take my other pocket bag, I want to press it the opposite way, and again I'm only stitching to where I've stitched previously for the understitching, and I'm going to keep my seam allowances untouched. So I've done my understitching on both sides. What I want to start to do is actually start turning everything inside. So I'll just push in my pocket like so, and for this one I am going to push Now what I want to do is actually join my two pocket bags together, but what we need to do first is anchor my corner points so they don't slip out. So I'm just going to zoom in my camera. At the bottom here, I have my triangular piece from the incision still open. What I want to do is I want to back tack along here just to keep this in place, and I'm back tacking to the lower pocket bag. So once I've done that, I can go around and I can stop my sewing at this point. I need to anchor my top point. I'm going to flick this out, and you need to stitch this here. So following your stitching here to here, you need to do a back tack, and this is only going to be stitched to one side of the bag. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and start stitching the two bags together. So starting from this stitch here, go all the way around at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, and then blending back to this stitch point. That way you can connect all the bags together. Once my pocket is done, it should look something like this. So you should see all of the raw edging caught, and all of this should be clean. And then on the opposite side, it should look something like this. So the edges have been caught to one side, and same with this one. Just my pressing can be done a bit better, and the whole bag is caught together. So now what I want to do is just pin this pocket bag out of place for now. And now I want to take this back to my machine, and I'm going to go over my previous top stitching, and I'm going to stitch these two corners down. So I've just drawn in roughly what my top stitching should look like. So I'm following the previous top stitching, and then I'm going to pivot and go around. So essentially it's going to create a box, and it's going to secure this whole welt pocket in place. And I'm going to do the same here. So roughly 1 mil away from the edge, I'm going to go and then blend it back with my previous stitching. This is what my finalized welt pocket should look like, and I'm just going to zoom out, and it should be nice and secured on either end and fully function. Open it, and there will be a completed pocket bag. Now that I've completed my welt pockets at the front, I've just gone ahead and joined my front to my back piece. So I've done that with both of them at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance, just all the way down, and I've just pressed it open just so it's nice and flat. And now what I want to do is I want to start working on the back. So in this case here, this is where the mitered corner is for the left hand side of the back. So what I want to do is I want to fold this in half, right sides together, and I'm only going to stitch at 0.5 mil and keeping these two seam allowances open. This is very important because later I need to stitch my lining to these seam allowance pieces. So these get kept open, and I'm going to stitch at 0.5 mil here. I've stitched my mitered corner. Now what I want to do is snip the corner, and now I need to bag it out, and it's going to create a diagonal seam here, and this will help create a clean hem. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take this to the iron. As a first step, I need to press the seam allowance open, and once I've done that, I just turn it in and create that nice point and just press this flat. This is what my vent will look like once it's pressed flat. So my vent will be looking like it's turning in like this, and the mitered corner is nice and flat, and it has that diagonal stitch. And I've just pressed temporarily this hem up. This is the right hand side vent of my main piece. So as you can see, there is no mitered corner here. So what I'm going to do now is just fold it 5 centimeters, my apologies. I'm going to fold it 5 centimeters up like this, and I'm going to stitch at 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm just going to stitch that part up, and I'm going to again leave my seam allowance unstitched here. So I've stitched that into place now. Now what I'm going to do is snip the corner, and I'm going to bag this out, and it should look something like this. And my seam allowance would be wanting to fold in like that, which is completely normal. I'm going to take this to the iron and give it a good press. So this is what everything looks like once it's been pressed. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is start connecting my center back seams together. I've just pinned my 2 center backs together, and the only parts that I'm going to stitch are the top of the vent. And keep in mind again, I'm keeping the seam allowance on both of the vents open. So the seam allowance is 1, and then I'm going to continue, and when I get to this point, I'm going to stick my needle in and pivot, and then stitch all the way up. So this is the top of the center back seam, and I'm just going to stitch that into. So now this is what it looks like with my seams stitched together. And when I get to this point here, as I spoke about before, what I want to do now is snip into here. Be careful not to snip past the stitching line. Roughly 5 mil away, you stop with the snip. And I'm going to press my upper body seam allowance open. And when it gets to the bottom here, I want to press my vent with the left hand side overlapping the right hand side. This is what the seam allowance should look like at the back, and this is what it should look like. I've joined my shoulder seams together and gave them a good press open, and now I'm going to put my main body to the side, and I'm going to start working on the sleeves. Start with my sleeves. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to align my upper sleeve with my undersleeve, and I'm going to join from this point to this point at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to do the same with this side. So again, 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. After I've joined those two together, I'm going to take them to my iron and press my seam allowances open. So this is what it's going to look like once I've attached my undersleeve to my upper sleeve and I've pressed my seam allowances open. I'm going to join my sleeve linings together. So I'm going to repeat the same process I did for my main sleeve. So I'm just going to join my seam allowances at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to press them open. To start off my sleeve insertion with the lining, what I need to do is actually flip this to the right side. I'm just going to be careful not to stretch out the armhole. So I turn this to the right side, and now I'm going to slip my lining into the main sleeve. So I'll get my main sleeve and then I'll slip it in. So it should look something like this. And essentially it's right sides facing one another. And now I'm going to start matching up my seams. And now I'm going to stitch the main to my lining at 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. There is a 1 centimeter seam allowance, but I'm just going to reduce the overall measurement because I need my sleeve to be longer, my sleeve lining to be slightly longer than my sleeve main. Now that those two are stitched, I'm going to start pulling, and I'm going to tuck my lining into the main sleeve. And now I need to start turning my cuff to the right length. So overall it is 4 centimeters in total. So my final cuff measurement is going to be 4. And once I finish with that, I'm just going to put a pin just to stabilize it. And I'm going to go all the way around. So just measuring for final length. So once that has been established, I need to turn my main fabric out again. So I'm just going to gently pull it out. And it should look something like this. And now I'm going to hand stitch my seam allowance to my fusing by hand. And essentially what I want to do with my cross stitches is I'm catching the seam allowance first, and then I'm going to catch my fusing and 1 centimeter from that, and then I'm going to catch my seam allowance again. Again, because I'm right-handed, I'm working from left to right, but if you're left-handed, you work from right to left. So again, I'm just catching two essentially portions of the fusing. I'm gonna catch my seam allowance again. Catch my fusing. So essentially what it's doing is creating a cross like this. Now once I'm done with that, I can start flipping everything to the right side again. And just take my pins out so they don't damage the fabric. And you should see that you have a clean finishing on the inside, and on the outside it will be a nice clean. It will be a nice and clean cuff. So that's exactly what we want, and our lining should be slightly longer, which is exactly what we want. I'm going to start attaching my sleeve to my main body. So the first step I need to do is match this notch with my underarm seam. So my underarm seam is going to be matched with my notch here. Then I'm going to go ahead and pin. Now I'm going to work from the inside of my body, just to make it a bit easier for myself. And there shouldn't be too much easing on this. But if there is, we're going to have to pin and ease this in slightly so it can match. So I'm just gonna go. So my sleeve head notch here is matched with my shoulder seam here. So now that it's all pinned, I'm going to go to my machine and stitch this at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. Now that I've joined my sleeve to my sleeve body, this is what it's going to look like on the inside. I need to grade my seam allowance from this point, so from this stitch on the underarm to this seam on the underarm, to roughly 0.6 or half this seam allowance on this. It's only to the underarm portion. I want to leave my upper portion because that won't interfere so much in the measurements. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and insert my other sleeve. I need to sew my shoulder pads into my shoulder seam and into my sleeve. So what I'm going to do, I'm using a raglan sleeve here because the raglan sleeve accommodates for the slope of the shoulder and it supports the head of the sleeve head. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position the middle section to the middle of the shoulder seam, and I'm going to pin that into place. This is a bit more of a softer shoulder pad, which is exactly what we want for this project. I'm going to anchor this top section first. So I'm just sewing it to the seam allowance. And now what I want to do, I'm just going to start pinning this overlocking along the seam allowance. And I'm just going to loosely tack this together. So I'm just starting at the seam allowance and I'm grabbing the overlocking and just doing a series of whip stitches, not too tight and not too loose, just to catch. Catch everything together. So now when I turn it to the right side, my shoulder is going to be nice and supported, and it's going to have a little cushion just to make the shape of this sleeve. Now that my raglan sleeves have been inserted, so my raglan is slightly supporting the shoulder while giving the shoulder a nice shape. What I want to do is actually stay stitch my collar onto my main body. So what I want to do now is just align center back with center back. And I'm just following the shape of my neckline here. And stitch at 0 degree away from the edge. So showing my little corner here with the seam allowance. So I'm just pinning that in place. And all of this I just need to morph into shape, and it should follow the 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to start my stitching from here and then go all the way around. So now I'm just going to stay stitch this, and then we'll move on to the lining. So with my lining pieces, what I've done is I've just joined my facing to my front body, and I've just pressed everything. So as I was pressing, I just pressed all the seam allowance into the lining section of my main lining. So it's not pressed open, I've just pressed everything into the body of the lining. Now what I want to do is I just want to do a simple stitch for my side seams to the back side seam panel, and I'm just going to press them open, and my seam allowance is 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. So I've sewn my side seam and I've pressed it open. Now it's time for me to start joining my center back seam. My center back seams. So this is where I'm going to stitch my 1.2 centimeter seam allowance. So as you can see, when I get to my vent section, there is this hollowed out section on the left hand side. So what essentially I need to do is I need to make, this is going to become a corner, and I need to pre-cut this. So this will be my stitching line. I need to pre-cut this section. So I'm just going to cut it here. So the only part that gets cut is the section that is including the vent. So I'm just going to pin this in place, and when I go to my sewing machine, so I'm going to leave my seam allowance open here, and I'm going to stitch, put my needle down here, and then I'm going to pivot the fabric and then continue sewing. This is a very important step because this is featured in a lot of jackets and coats, and it's to accommodate for the vent at the back. So now I'm approaching this cut section here of the vent. So I'm just gonna go slowly. Okay, I'm gonna lift my foot and my needle needs to be in my fabric. And now I'm just gonna shift my fabric. Be careful not to catch any fabric here because it will create a dimple, and I'm only going to the stitch line and I'm keeping my seam allowance unstitched. So this is what my center back seam should look like now. So it should have a nice corner like this. This is to accommodate for the shape of the vent. So now what I'm going to do is at the top of my center back seam, I need to align my two true center back notches together. Or if you're making a menswear jacket, it needs to be left over right. So mine's a women's wear jacket, women's wear coat, I must say. I'm just going to pin that into place, like so. And I'm just going to do a stay stitch at the top here, at 0.3 mils away from the edge. Once I have this center back seam finalized and pressed into shape, what I want to do now is just join my shoulder seams together. And I'm joining my shoulder seams at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. I just need to talk about the vent. So I did do a mistake with my vent. Originally my miter corner was on this side, so I had to patch a section of fabric to accommodate for that, and then I had to miter my right hand side. So the mitered corner should be on the right hand side and the non-mitered corner should be on the left hand side. So apologize, but this is the mistake that I need to correct, and I've corrected it now, and I will talk you through the bagging out process now. So now what I need to do is, for my left hand section of my jacket, I'm just going to pin, and my seam allowance is going to be sticking out here. So I'm going to stitch the bottom of my vent first, and I'm stitching this at 1 centimeter seam allowance. And I'm just going to stitch to this point of my jacket. So to my original seam, so the side seam, I'm only going to stitch from here to the side seam. So I'm going to take this to my machine, and starting at the stitch line here, I'm going to stitch to the side seam here at 1 centimeter seam allowance. So now that I have this section of my vent complete, so I've just stitched it to the hem, I'm going to grab my lining now, and I'm just going to shift, and I'm going to start pinning the top of my vent lining to the top of the main vent. So here, where I haven't stitched, where I've left the seam allowance unstitched, this is what I'm going to align it to. So see here how I haven't stitched my seam allowance. So I'm going to open both of them and open them to match the vent on the main. And I'm going to start my stitch at the last stitch of the lining, and I'm going to work my way down. So when I get to this section here, what I want to do, I've just flipped my hem to the wrong side again, and I'm going to push all of my lining down to meet the stitching, and then I just put a pin there, and then all of this excess I pleat up like this. So very important, because we want that extra fabric because the lining always has to be longer and bigger than the main to prevent puckering. So where this stitch is right here, that's where I'm going to end my stitch. So again, starting my stitch here, and I'm going to end my stitch at the end of the stitching at the hem. So once I have that stitched, I'm going to turn it inside out just so you guys can see what it looks like. So it should look like this. So this is my hem. So this should be one side of the vent, and this is the vent that is the internal vent, and it should start to take form at the top. And again, a little pleat is created, which is exactly what we want. So I can take this to the iron and give it a good press, and we'll go on to the other side of the vent. Right side to right side, and I'm just following. So essentially this will get stitched down to my vent here. So what I need to join now is the hem to the hem. This is very same concept. I'm leaving roughly 1 centimeter sticking out of this section, and the miter corner should be left unstitched here. So it's only stitched to the stitching line, and I'm just going to position it into place. And again, I'm only going to the side seam. And I'm going to stitch from my side seam, and I'm going to end my stitch with my 1 centimeter seam allowance sticking out. So we'll do that and we'll continue. I've stitched my hem to my lining hem now. So now what I need to work with, again, I'm just going to turn my mitered corner out just so it's easier for me to work with. And I'm going to start at the top again. So here, where I've left my seam allowance unstitched, again, I'm going to position it so the stitching needs to be on the stitching. So essentially it will look like that. So I'm going to work my way down. Into the hem. So all of this excess here, I'm pushing it all the way down to here. So this is where I'm going to end. So where my stitching of the miter corner is, where I've left it unstitched, that's where I'm going to place a pin. So it'll look like this, and I'm pushing it all the way to the bottom, and all of this excess will get pushed up like that. So just so you guys don't get confused, it gets pushed up like this, and then I pin it into place again, and essentially it's going to create that pleat again, which is exactly what we want. So now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine, and starting my stitch from the ending of this stitch line at the hem, I'm going to go all the way up and align it with the stitching on the top of my vent. I have this section completed now, and what I need to do is this junction of the lining only. I just need to give it a good snip at the top for my lining, and I'm just going to go 5 mil away from the stitching because I don't want it to pucker and create pleats in this section. This is just to allow the fabric to release slightly. Now I need to start the process of actually bagging out my lining to my main fabric. So these are my facing pieces. One thing to keep in mind is that the bottom of my facing and this front section of my jacket I'm just drawing in my seam allowance essentially here. I need to start my stitching at this junction here. So essentially I'm keeping my seam allowance here unstitched, and I'm starting here and I'm working my way up. Now for this section where I've stay stitched my collar to my main body, I need to catch. So I'm going to push the collar down and I'm going to pin all of my raw edges together, because essentially the collar has already been bagged out and I just need to stitch everything to encase the collar using the sandwich method with this stitching. So again, I'm just pushing my collar down, and this would be my shoulder seam. So shoulder seam on shoulder seam, and I just pin that into place. And I'm just pinning it into place. And I repeat this process all the way. So again, when I get to this section of my facing, I'm going to stop my stitching at this point. So essentially I'm leaving my seam allowance open. So when I go to start stitching, I'm going to start from here and work my way all the way around and catching all of my collar into place. And then I'm going to work my way around to the facing again, and then I'm going to stop at this junction of the facing. So we'll do that and we'll continue. Once I've stitched around all the way around my lining to my main fabric, what I need to do is I need to finalize all of this section. So as we can see before, I've only stitched for the hem section to the side seam, and all of this section is still left open. So this is the bottom of the front. And again, I mentioned before that we've only stitched to the stitch line. What I need to do now is actually snip 5 millimeters away from the stitching, snip this section so I can make it workable. So I'm just going to do that now. So essentially this is what it looks like now, which is exactly what I want. And now I'm going to go ahead to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch the remainder of this with roughly 1 centimeter. Now that I've stitched my lining to my hem section, I'm just going to turn this over to the other side. And now what I want to do is I want to start pinning this section, which I've left 10 centimeters unstitched from the facing to the front lining. I'm going to start pinning just a little bit at the top. And now this section here, this section where I've cut, I'm going to place a pin here temporarily, just so I know where the position is. And I'm going to fold all of this section up here like this. And because I've snipped like this, it should open up, and this is exactly what I want. So now I'm going to stitch all of this section to this point here. So once this has been finalized, the corner of the vent of the front facing, what I want to go ahead and do is any corner that's sticking out or is at a sharp point, I just want to trim that off. So the corner of the facing, the corner of the lapel, the other corner of the lapel, and the other side of the facing. Now I'm going to turn everything inside out. So just using my armhole, I'm just going to gently start turning everything inside out. So this is what the bagged out section of the facing to the hem should look like. It should look like a nice corner here with the pleat, the front pleat like this. And I'm just going to make sure all of my corners are nice and sharp. So anything such as the lapel, so this is the lapel here, I can just gently put my scissors through the armhole and just give it a gentle push like that. And for the bottom of the front, so I can do the same. Please be careful when you're doing this not to cut through any of your fabric. And don't push too hard where your scissors are actually going to puncture the fabric. So just very gently, just push that corner out. Beautiful. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm only going to understitch my lining to the seam allowance part of my collar because I don't want it to keep wobbling around. So I'm only stitching this top section 3 mils away from the edge. So I'm only going to be stitching to this point. So all of this needs understitching to prevent all of this from flicking up. So we'll do that and we'll continue. As you can see here, I've done my understitching just to keep all of my main body in the main body. Now what I want to do is I want to take this to my iron and give this a good press. So I'm going to push everything out and just give it a nice press. And then we'll continue on and we'll do our top stitching details. I've given my coat a good press and now what I want to do is I'm going to start my top stitching. So I'm going to start my top stitching right at the bottom of my facing here, and I'm going to go 1 centimeter all the way around. And for this section here, there is a specific detail that I need to point out. For this section here, the top stitching roughly goes like this. So essentially it's creating a little W shape. So what you need to do is pivot here, and when you get to here, go in the seam and then go around all the way, and we're top stitching all the way to the other side of the facing. So once the top stitching is complete, it should look something like this. So I've done my top stitching all the way to this point, and it should just be ended like that, and it will give a nice touch to the jacket overall. So now what I want to do is I want to start catching the hem to my fusing. So down here, I just want to lift up my lining, and I want to start pinning my hem, and I want to use my armhole opening to get inside again. And now what I'm going to do, like I did with the cuffs of my sleeve, I want to catch my seam allowance to the fusing of my body. And I'm going to use a series of cross stitches, just like we did with the sleeve, to catch this into place. So now that I have my needle and thread knotted, I'm starting by catching my seam allowance. And again, I'm catching 2 portions, roughly 1 centimeter apart. Then I'm just going to keep going. And once I'm finished with that, I can just turn this back to the right side. So all of that is caught into place. So my hem will not be undone. So I'm going to repeat the process with my right hand side. Now that my hem is tucked into place, I need to start working on finishing my shoulder to my lining. So I've just pinned my sleeve lining just to keep it out of the way when I'm sewing the main body and attaching the linings. What I want to do now is I want to start pinning my lining along the armhole. So along the armhole seam allowance of my main body. So I'm going to do this all the way. And now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a basting stitch all the way around at 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm only catching this to my seam allowance. I'm not going to go further in because the stitching might peek through into the main body, which is not what I want because it won't be nice. Now that I've just basted my lining to my armhole, what I want to do is actually I just want to slip my arm until it peeks through, because I don't want my lining to twist, because sometimes it does get twisted in the arm and then we go to construct it and the arm can't actually slip out of the armhole. So what I'm going to do now is I'm looking where my notch is, my sleeve head notch. I'm folding it in at 5 mil, and I'm going to fold it over the basting stitch. And I'm just going to pin that into place. So I'm going to continue doing that. So essentially what I'm doing is just folding the seam allowance. Folding the seam allowance like this. And pinning it into shape. So here, because there is easing in the pattern, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a little pleat, and that's perfectly acceptable for the lining section of this. So once I'm happy with the pinning, I'm going to start my slip stitch. So to start the slip stitch, I'm just going to anchor my thread in a discrete place. Start my slip stitch, I'm basically going under all the layers, and I'm catching one portion of the folded edge of the sleeve, and I repeat this process. So I go underneath all the layers, I catch one portion, pull it up, and between each stitch is roughly 5 millimeters. And I'm going to continue this all the way around, securing everything into place, and essentially creating a nice clean finish around the armhole. So this is what the finished armhole should look like. It should be nice and clean, and there should be one tuck at the top because of the easing. There's no easing in the lining, so I've just created a tuck. Now I've just gone back to my back vent. So my back vent is not actually secured down properly yet. So what I need to do is I need to pin all of my layers together like so. Once open it up, essentially what we're going to do is a stitch in the ditch, but for this top vent section, and this should secure the vent into place, and it's going to show on the outside with a little diagonal stitching, but that's completely normal. So this is what the finished result should look like. It should look like the seam is invisible because it is a stitch in the ditch. It will look like a little diagonal stitch on the outside, which is completely normal, and it has a nice finish, and we'll continue on with the next step. To start off my thread marking, what I need to do is I need to baste the start of my button. So I'm just going to go over the same area 3 times, roughly 1 centimeter in length. And then I'm going to go in the center to mark where the center placement is. Yeah, Anon. Coming. And then when I get to the end, I just want to repeat the same 3. So because my buttonholes are 3 centimeters in total measurement, my buttonhole is going to be 3.5. So what I'm going to do now is actually create a button with a shank. So I have to anchor my thread first, just using a regular knot. And then when I get through the other side, I'm going to get my button and so as I'm pulling my button in, I want to leave roughly 1 centimeter of that thread loose. This is very important because I need to create that distance for all the layers to go through on the other side of the jacket. So I'm just looping twice into the button because I want to keep my button nice and strong. Now when I pull out here, once I'm done, I'm going to grab my thread and I'm going to wrap it around 8 times. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And as you can see here, it would have created this spiral knotted thing. Now I just want to put my needle through all of those layers and stick it through the entry hole again. And now I'm just securing my button and tying off a knot.